Now, where's Nowinski going? This is something we don't normally see.
And that's the reason why.
I don't think anybody watching on television can quite appreciate how dangerous it really is. The margin of error is incredibly small. So if any timing or anyone's positioning is off by inches, someone's going to get hurt.
The violence may be more for show than real, but it turns out the potential danger of injury, especially to the brain, is much higher than people realize. Wrestling, as in many sports such as American football, involves a degree of force and contact that can turn a healthy brain to mush with terrible consequences.
I kept thinking I'm going to get better tomorrow, and after 12 months of constant headaches and sleepwalking and memory problems, I just never got better. And so that was the last time I ever got near a ring.
Former professional wrestler Chris Nowinski describing there what turned into a very dark time in his life, ending his career as an athlete, but one that ultimately led him to a path that is already saving thousands of lives. Hello and welcome, I'm Riz Khan. The excitement of competitive sports is hard to beat and drives athletes to push themselves to the limit. But over the past couple of decades, the risk of concussion and brain damage involved in contact sports has been revealed through some very tragic stories, where athletes have experienced serious behavioral changes and have taken their own lives or even killed others. Our guest on this show, Chris Nowinski, had a promising career playing American football from a young age, before becoming something of a star in the world of professional wrestling. But after suffering repeated violent blows to the head and regular severe concussions, his life took a turn that forced him to face reality. He could no longer continue to enjoy his rising career in the world of wrestling. Instead, he turned his Harvard-educated brain to finding out what exactly was going on in the minds of athletes, both metaphorically and literally, when they faced repeated severe head trauma. He wrote a book, Head Games, Football's Concussion Crisis, that was turned into a powerful documentary, one that has opened the eyes of sporting associations such as football's NFL, challenging their policies on injured athletes. Dr. Nowinski also founded the Concussion Legacy Foundation and is now a staunch campaigner and fundraiser, providing crucial support for players and their families dealing with CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy.
Chronic traumatic encephalopathy can only be diagnosed after death. And so because of 1,000 generous families, more than a dozen who are with us tonight, we finally understand what is happening to our loved ones.
I caught up with him on the road in Chicago, where he relived the personal journey that has left him with possible health concerns and an uncertain future. Dr. Nowinski, I'm glad you could take some time to talk about this very important subject. I know it's very much a passion for you to make sure you make people aware of this, so we'll go through quite a lot in this interview. Now, you've got a solid pedigree in academia. You're a Harvard graduate, as well as being a sporting star in terms of your wrestling career with WWE. What was the appeal of wrestling for you? Because you excelled in football too. What was it that made you go into wrestling?
I became a fan of wrestling while I was in college. I lived with a bunch of guys and we watched. I got a regular, I wasn't drafted in the NFL. I worked out for some teams, didn't make that cut. Didn't feel like I was done with my sports career, but I took a real job in life sciences consulting in the medical world. And just so happened that the owner of the firm had a history in wrestling and knew people. And just one conversation of, you should try this, turned into me getting a tryout and realizing that I dabbled in theater, I'd played sports. I thought it was more fun to be a wrestler in my early 20s rather than sitting at a desk all day.
So from what I've seen, it was a fun time. I mean, you were there out in the media quite a lot as well, making a name for yourself as well. And what were the highlights for you at that time?
Yeah, I mean, I only was able to wrestle for just over a year on WWE Monday Night Raw because I had too many concussions. But while I was there, I got to be in the Royal Rumble, which was a blast. I got to wrestle The Undertaker a few times, got to wrestle people like Scott Steiner and Booker T. Like, it was so cool wrestling, your heroes. And just being part of this group that, captivated millions every Monday night.
I'm going to get on to how things changed for you at that early age in a moment. But I'm guessing for a lot of the public who don't follow wrestling closely, they imagine that it's kind of, very much a show and it's staged and it's not that physically brutal. But I'm guessing that, from what I read about the things you say, is that it is a lot harsher on your body than people imagine.
Yeah, it's surprisingly hard on the body. So the beauty is you're not trying to hurt each other, but you're basically doing very complicated stunt work without any rehearsals and in front of a live audience where anything can happen. So while if you do it well, you feel like $1,000,000. When things go wrong, things can go really wrong.
And it was in 2003. I mean, you were about 25 years old when something started to go wrong. Take me through what happened.
Yeah, I was only 24 and I was wrestling, and I kind of kept getting concussions but didn't realize it. And it all came to a head in June 2003 when I got kicked in the head by Bubba Ray Dudley, and I got a concussion where the symptoms just didn't clear. So when I used to get concussions, you'd feel weird for a couple of days and you'd be fine. This one, I had a headache that really kind of lasted 10 years. And I tried to lie through it they could tell something was wrong. I had to go to doctors, but I wouldn't tell them everything. And I kept wrestling until it got so bad that I could barely hold a conversation. And I developed a sleep disorder called REM behavior disorder, which was the thing that scared me straight, to be honest, because I woke up learning I had acted out a dream and jumped off a bed through a nightstand and didn't remember or feel any of it.
Because you're supposed to actually be paralyzed when you're sleeping in terms of your physiology.
Right. It's something you learn when they tell you what REM behavior disorder is, right? Your limbs are actually paralyzed when you're dreaming. And if that breaks, which it basically broke in my brain, anything can happen.
Now, the way you talk about concussion, it sounds like wrestlers and sports people know what concussions are and kind of deal with them all the time.
Yeah, we do now. Back then, we didn't know what concussions were. And so all of us if we got knocked out, but it was brief, or if we had double vision, or we couldn't remember what was happening, we'd call it a ding, we'd call it a bell ringer. But as long as you were able to work, you would keep working, even through the headaches and the pain, because no one had ever told us what a brain injury was and what it meant for us. And no one ever told us that if you just let your brain recover, that it minimizes long-term effects and helps you get back as fast as possible. So back then, I'd say 95% of concussions were never diagnosed. And they just kept, for some people, piling on each other until it was real and potentially permanent.
So for the sportsman, for the athlete, it was just basically not feeling right for a while. Is that it?
Well, I mean, everyone's, post-concussion journey is different. But yeah, I mean, most concussions actually the symptoms don't last very long. They only last like minutes or hours. And so back in the day, if you had symptoms that lasted minutes or hours, you would wait it out. And if you felt fine the next day, you would never say anything about what happened the day before. But now that we understand, like when symptoms start to last days and days and days, that people get more likely to say, all right, something's not right. Now that they know that if you go back and you take another hit, you can actually die from second impact syndrome, and there are real consequences. But back then, you sort of judged every injury by, can I keep working, right? Whether it was your foot or whether it was your brain, as long as you could remember the match, or as long as you could walk, you would wrestle or play football or whatever. And that was a bad idea.
And actually listening to conversations you've had and interviews you've done, you were actually trying as much as possible not to kind of admit that there was something wrong.
Yeah, there was I didn't fully appreciate how bad things were, but there was a time where I took a week off, and then I felt like I was getting pressure to go back. And so I lied to my doctor. I went back, and as I'm practicing, like discussing the next match, because it was a complicated tag team match, we had this complicated finish, and I sat there and I go, I can't remember. Like I'd sit there and I could not make it stick in my brain. And that was not, I was Chris Harvard to everyone. I was the guy who never forgot anything in the ring. You could count on me. So I remember telling the guys, like, look, for some reason I can't seem to remember, like my brain's not working. So if I space out there, tell me what to do. And nobody knew back then to go, we shouldn't let you out there because you're dangerous to all of us. Instead, it was like, okay, we'll cover for you. And that was the culture we had.
I should point out, by the way, Chris Harvard was the fighting name you used for a while as well.
Well, Chris Harvard was my unofficial fighting name
okay.
because it came off a reality show. I think WWE was worried about trademark infringement.
Oh, with Harvard University, of course, yeah. But you were a graduate.
But I was a graduate. No, I actually learned as the dean of admissions at Harvard, loved it because I was introducing Harvard to a whole different generation.
Yeah. Now, you were saying it lasted about a decade that you were going through all this. And if what I read was correct, there was literally a headache for 3 years. I mean, how do you deal with that?
I was lucky to be hurt in my 20s where I could just like disappear. So like I lived alone, and there are days I wouldn't leave the house. There are days that my head would hurt so much I would, drink a lot and try to fall asleep at 4 o'clock and hope the next day I'd wake up and my headache would be less. Like it was, you can get to a strange place when your head hurts that much. But I luckily, got through it, had support, had good doctors who kept trying to help me get better. And eventually, 23 years later, I don't have headaches every day and I feel pretty good.
Well, so we'll get on to how things have changed in a bit more detail, because that's what's really interesting, especially with your advocacy. But let's explain CTE to those who don't know it. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Explain that and what it really is about.
So chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, is what we used to call punch drunk. So for 100 years, we've known that boxers, if you get hit in the head your whole career, will eventually start having problems with their cognition, their speech, their movement. We never looked outside of other sports. And now we realize that you hit anyone in the head a few thousand times, they're at risk for developing a distinct degenerative brain disease that starts as microscopic lesions, usually in the frontal lobe and in areas that are sensitive to a quickly rotating brain causing injury. And those lesions then will continue to spread throughout your life, we believe in most people, so that your brain is literally degenerating and symptoms start to appear as you lose more functioning brain. And you have problems with your behavioral regulation, you have problems with cognition and memory and executive functioning, and eventually it can cause dementia.
And of course, it goes to different levels, different degrees, correct?
Right. Well, we understand there wasn't even a criteria to diagnose CT that was agreed upon until 2015. So that was because of our work. But essentially, there's 4 stages pathologically, where, again, it's microscopic lesions, and then by stage 3, it moves to new areas of your brain, including your hippocampus and amygdala, which controls short-term memory and fight or flight and emotional responses. And then when it gets to stage 4, most people are no longer able to take care of themselves, and that's where you get functional dementia.
Now, having the word chronic in it, in CTE, implies that there's no real treatment. I mean, there's treatment, I guess, but no real cure.
Well, there's even debate around why chronic is even in there, right? Because the question is it they're referring to the chronic trauma or the chronic symptoms? And there's no answer for that, because it was decided in the 1930s and those people are dead. But yes, the idea is that there is a chronic disease. Once you have it, it does not go away. And again, in most cases, it appears to spread. And while there isn't a treatment for it today, because we can't even diagnose or measure it, we can treat the symptoms. So we don't want people to feel hopeless if they might have it. But it's certainly a formidable disease.
Now, in that sense, is it preventable, or at least, its advancement preventable, or is it simply manageable?
So the disease itself, the science says, is entirely environmentally caused. So you are not born with CT. We've never seen CT in someone younger than 17 years old. But if everyone who ever had it, 99% of them, you could actually go find their sports histories in football, boxing, rugby, soccer, whatever. And so that's one of the interesting public health issues with this, is that we all accept it in boxers, but when it started to be found in American football and in soccer and in rugby, those professional sports leagues saw liability, and they saw people potentially not having as much fun watching the collisions or not letting their kids play. And so they put up this giant front to say, no, wait, it's not proven that our sports are causing this. And so we sort of had to redo all the research. And so it took us about a decade to convince the NFL. It took us more than a couple hundred cases to convince them, look, this is an NFL problem. And they've admitted it, but World Rugby, FIFA, all these groups still deny it. And so it's one of these really sad issues that the opportunity is very clear. CT does not have to exist in the world outside of abuse or military service with explosions, but sports should not be causing brain disease. But we are not really trying to prevent it right now. And so we're just sentencing another generation to this horror.
Cynics might say there's a lot of money in the sport now, so in various sports.
It's even harder because there's so many billions involved in the sports now.
Take me through your personal journey, though. What were the kind of things that started to happen to you day to day that started to give you those warning signs?
Well, I mean, the question for me is around concussion CT, right? So I definitely developed post-concussion syndrome, where I had the headaches, I had the sleep disorder, my cognition wasn't so good, but that's actually slowly gotten better over time. And so I've never had a definite label of CTE. That being said, some of my scans, some of the things would be suggestive. I'm certainly at risk for it. But I sort of feel like I'm getting better. I'm still getting better from the concussion, but the basic idea is at some point things will probably start to slide for me in a more significant way. And I've been doing this so long now that I've been tracking people for 20 years. Like, we just diagnosed my college roommate with this disease, who was the captain of our Harvard team, who was, the guy we all looked up to, who developed a very serious alcohol disorder and died from it. And he had stage 2 CTE, and he played exactly as many years of football as I did. And so it makes you look at that and go, if he had it, there's probably a good chance I have it.
In terms of diagnosis, of course, if you can actually look at a brain after the person is deceased, you can actually have a better idea of what's been going on. But while a person's alive, what can you find out?
So we can't diagnose CT definitively. And we're sort of at where you were with Alzheimer's 20 years ago. Right now, back 20 years ago, if you were told grandma has Alzheimer's, it was a very educated guess, and they knew they were right about 4 to 5 times. Then they developed the ability to image beta amyloid plaque. And now the diagnosis is much more definitive. If you have a lot of these plaques, you have Alzheimer's disease. So for us, no one's ever done the work on CTE. When I helped create the Boston University CT Center back in 2008, we were the first academic center in the world ever focused on this. And so we have a lot of catching up to do. And so basically the abnormal tau protein in CTE, we just learned in 2019, is misfolded differently than Alzheimer's disease. And that's why all the Alzheimer's imaging agents don't work for CTE. And so we basically now have to convince scientists to build from the ground up a way to diagnose CT in life like they have with Alzheimer's. But at the same time, we don't know how big CT is. And so no one knows how much money to invest towards this disease because we haven't been able to diagnose it.
Have you been able to get funding though easily, or is it still one of those?
Not easily. I mean, not by any stretch easily. I mean, thank goodness the VA in the US and the National Institutes of Health has, the scientists there have seen it, but there's no dedicated funding to this.
What you're talking about is something that actually is quite scary to think. This is only about 20 years.
Yeah.
That, this really started to be in your life and then started to get out there into the public domain with your advocacy, for example. As a young athlete, what kind of advice and support structure was there for you?
As a young athlete, there was nothing.
There was nothing. Huh?
Besides the fact that we didn't understand concussions and we didn't, so everyone was playing through them, like there was no concept of CTE. Like I remember thinking, if this was bad for my brain, I'm sure one of these adults around me would have told me, and they wouldn't let me do this, right? So you had this great trust in the coaches and the administrators. You thought you were protected by this helmet. I mean, I remember looking back now how stupid we were at Harvard in the 90s, that when we would get every preseason during two-a-days, massive headaches as linemen. And we'd all talk about it. Like you'd get in a 3-point stance, tip your head and think you're going to fall over because you can feel the blood moving because your brain's swollen. And you remember, just then they had invented helmets where they had air in them to make them fit better. And so if you would tell the medical staff, like, my head really hurts, you'd get more air in your helmet. And they just pump it up and just make it tighter. But that wasn't protecting your brain. That helmet was there to protect your skull. They hadn't even conceived of what was going on in your brain back then. So it's sort of like, you look back and you're like, God, that was a really bad idea for us to all strap on a hard-shelled helmet and just bash each other with our heads all day long. But at that point, there were 5 million kids in the United States doing that every year. And so everyone just thought it was normal.
And of course, you have the skull, which is a protective shell, but you have the deceleration and acceleration injuries from all this trauma, presumably.
Yeah, you sort of aren't born both understanding that your brain is soft and also understanding that it doesn't have any pain nerves. So when your brain's bouncing around or stretching and tearing, you can't feel it. And so that's why we've been so reckless, is because it's so easy to put a helmet on and hit someone in the head because you don't feel it. And you only feel it if someone gets you well, but most of the time you don't feel anything there either.
Tell me what happened, what was going through your mind when you realized this is the end of your wrestling career, just as things were kind of good.
Yeah, I mean, I do look back and, for those who don't, no one remembers me, but they don't remember that my class back in 2003, 2004 was John Cena and Brock Lesnar and Dave Bautista and Randy Orton. And some of the guys are still going. I mean, just absolute legends. And they're all amazing what they do. And I don't know if I'd ever be able to get that far, but I still have the 2003 Raw magazine where they named me Newcomer of the Year. Like, people expected things from me. So I miss, because that job is still a lot more fun than my job is today, which is, can be, which I enjoy.
It's more valuable,
but it's it can be harsh. So anyway, so I had high hopes for that, but I did, when my head hurt so much, I decided that after 12 months of like literally going, I don't want to get out of bed, like I'm not sure if I want to be here. I said, if I ever get my brain health back, I'm not going to risk it going back to this because I couldn't imagine going through this twice after I got better.
Are there better definitions now since awareness has increased? I mean, do people define concussion in a better way now, for example?
Yeah, I mean, the definition of concussion is actually its own slippery conversation because there's 40 different definitions in the literature and it keeps evolving and changing over time. So the definition is actually not that great because we still don't have a biomarker for CTE. We still don't have a biomarker for concussion. It's still a clinical judgment. So basically, you get hit, you experience something, you might show some symptoms, you might not. Whatever you tell them is how they determine whether or not you had a concussion or not. We're getting to the point where now we can actually pick up brain proteins in your blood. And so that's one way we understand concussion is they're actually tearing axons. There's also the neurometabolic cascade of concussion, which is all these, microscopic metabolic and chemical changes that we can't pick up and test. So no, concussion is still very much a clinical gray area.
The technology presumably is improving to the point where hopefully we'll have the right kind of technology to know. I mean, AI.
Yes, no, I mean,
AI
people
help?
are finally investing in it, right? So you can now get, there is blood work and there's some saliva work that maybe on the sideline within 15 minutes, you could determine that you've had a concussion. But the reality is it's probably never going to be perfect.
Well, Dr. Nowinski, you got a PhD in behavioral neurosciences. 2017, I think, is when you got the PhD. And as you were kind of researching all this, following your own personal experience, what was it that made you want to go into kind of much more extensive research into what was happening to athletes?
So it was actually only about 3 months after I was hurt that I went to the 8th doctor that WWE sent me to try to sort of figure it out. Dr. Robert Cantu, who was one of the pioneers of concussion. And he, in that first meeting, was the one who sort of flipped the switch for me by helping me understand. He said, when I first got in there, he said, how many concussions have you had before this? And at that time, my answer was 0, because I had never been diagnosed by a guy in a white coat with a concussion. And he said, okay, no, you don't think you've had a concussion, but how many times were you hit in the head and you couldn't remember where you were, you saw stars, or you were double vision or ringing in your ears? And I was like, well, that happens all the time. And I started telling stories about these times. This scar is from when I got this elbow and this. And he goes, okay, well, you've had a lot of concussions. You never took any time off. That made each one a little worse. And this might have added up over time to create this problem. And I was like, why the heck did I not know that? Like, I would have taken a couple weeks off after the sky would go orange on me and I couldn't remember my name. Like I was so frustrated by that. And then step 2 was, as I dug into the research, realizing that we'd actually cared about concussions 100 years ago. I found in the diary of the Harvard football coach in 1905, he kept the captain of the team out of the Harvard-Yale game because he was concerned he had a concussion. Like in the 1950s, the Harvard team doctor had a 3 concussions in your lifetime and I'm retiring you policy. And then the NFL, it became a talking point in the 1990s because 2 famous NFL players, Steve Young and Troy Aikman, had their careers ended because of concussions. And the NFL decided we're going to get involved. And they started conducting research that I suspect, and I ended up writing about, I thought was aimed at minimizing the problem and not finding the issue. And so I sort of realized that in my mind, the NFL was covering it up.
Well, so it was only, to your credit, a few years later, after you'd given up the wrestling in 2006, that you wrote the book, Head Games, Football's Concussion Crisis, which really opened some eyes at the NFL, didn't it? What sort of reaction did you get from them from the book?
Well, I mean, it was a cone of silence from the book. I mean, the reality was I remember trying to promote the book and talking to reporters I knew from wrestling. And I remember one of them, was Chicago-based, actually called me back and said, we have to cancel the interview tomorrow. I just got called from a vice president I've never heard of who said, you cannot interview that person, put them on our TV, because they were worried the NFL would no longer give them rights to use their footage. And so the reality was the book, nobody paid attention to, but certain people read it and realized I was right. And the way I got people to pay attention to this was not through the book itself, but was starting to get the brains of athletes when they died to prove that you could actually see the problem in this disease, CTE.
But I guess the key was that there were those who recognized the book was going down a path that would expose a lot.
Luckily, literally one of my advocates back then was a reporter at the New York Times who had read it and thought that it had something. And so it did allow people to believe that I knew what I was talking about.
Now, you even had Jesse Ventura, the former governor of Minnesota, himself a professional professional wrestler, take part involved as well. And you were saying that he actually is quite an advocate for it as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was actually Vince McMahon who told me, like, Jesse's teaching a class at Harvard, go talk to him. And so I stopped him and we chatted, and I remember handing him like a 300-page printout of the book, and he started looking at it. He goes, yeah, this totally makes sense to me, and whatever I can do to help. He introduced me to his agent. He said, I'll write the forward, whatever I can do to help you get that platform. So, I mean, it was such a generous move by him to help me use his celebrity to help get people to pay attention to this.
Now, you'd mentioned it a moment ago about the actually getting athletes' brains. And I think a turning point was when the family of football player Andre Waters was asking you to take, or they sent you part of his brain, I think, to examine. Tell me how that story went.
Yeah, so it was about a month after the book came out. No one cared, but I knew I wrote a chapter about the first 2 cases of CTE diagnosed in NFL players, and it made sense to me that if boxers got this disease, what's the difference with football players? And so when Waters, the story came out that he took his life, and everyone was surprised by it. He was a football coach. He was employed. Like, there was nothing obvious.
Andre Waters committed suicide November 20th, 2006. And he was a coach, and he was working, and it wasn't money problems, and it seemed kind of bizarre.
I like to hit things. I can get all my frustration out on the field.
And I was shocked to find that he was quoted in the newspaper saying he stopped counting his concussions at 15, and he would just grab smelling salts and keep playing.
And I remember thinking, he was a huge hitter when he played, and his nickname was Dirty Waters because he had to lead with his helmet. And I spent time online searching and found a quote where he said, I stopped counting my concussions at 15. I would sniff smelling salts. I'd keep playing. I was like, everything lined up to me that this guy might have had CTE. And part of that was because the first 2 cases, both died at 45 and 50, and both had very similar, like, bizarre turns in their lives. So I ended up calling the medical examiner after I didn't hear anything about anyone studying his brain. And I said, hey, are you going to study him for CT? And he told me I was crazy. But I said, well, read some of these articles. So I sent him a bunch of stuff and a dialogue over a few weeks where I kept pestering him, even after Andre was buried, because I just wanted to know if I could convince this random doctor that there was something to this. I wasn't confident back then. But he read enough that he said, actually, there's enough literature here where I could justify giving you his brain. Per Florida law, I had to keep 5 pieces of it, and you might be able to get a diagnosis off that. I had no idea this was a thing. And so he said, so I'll give it to you if you find a doctor to study it, and you just have to get his mother's permission, who was next of kin. So then I had to make the choice of cold calling his family to say, hey, you think Andre's buried, but actually some of his brain's still up here, and can we have it? And the reality was they were so generous in learning why I cared. They appreciated that someone cared why Andre died. And so they ended up saying yes, and he had CTE, and that just sort of started this chain reaction that we're now, 1,600 brains later, we've been able to show that this is everywhere.
Is this now something that people are so aware of? You're saying 1,600, that you expect this to keep growing so people, you could map out a much better situational map.
Yeah. I mean, what was interesting is that even by the 3rd brain that I coordinated, they actually, I remember I called the Grimsley household. John had just died at the age of 45, and a friend answered the phone and yelled across the room to his widow, Virginia. He said, this guy Chris Nowinski on the phone, and I heard her say, tell him I know who he is, I know why he's calling, and the answer is yes, because they'd seen a TV report on this. And I think the problem was huge, but it was buried. Like, who would tell the world how bad their husband was doing, right? When they're celebrities and they were living off their reputations, and so it snowballed very quickly that NFL families started giving us their brains, and then it just expanded from there.
Tell me about the Concussion Legacy Foundation that you co-founded. What have you achieved with it so far?
So we essentially do 3 things. One is the research. We know about the brain bank and the fact that we've created a diagnostic criteria for CT, and now we're creating the way to diagnose it clinically in partnership with Boston University's CT Center. we've tried to forever translate that into safer sports. And so we now have laws in all 50 states around concussions to protect athletes, that they have to be cleared by a doctor, they have to have training and coaches and the athletes. We've had some small victories on CT prevention. You can't head a soccer ball until 11 years old now in the United States. In football, they've completely changed how we practice, although they could still go much further. Ice hockey raised the age of checking from 11 to 13 to minimize head trauma for kids. So that's been good. And then we're trying to figure out how to help people. So we have a helpline and a patient services team that just takes inbound people going, my husband's losing his mind, what can we do?
Now that you have something that is so empirical, are you getting less resistance from organizations like the NFL?
Yes, absolutely less resistance. They don't necessarily like to talk about it, but they're proactively changing the rules of their game all the time. Last year we saw a new kickoff that no one's really asking for, but has dramatically reduced head impacts. So that part has been good. And there's far more services for retired players who are struggling. I don't like the fact the NFL is still recruiting 5-year-olds to play tackle football, and we're still creating this problem. But if you understand it from a business perspective, they need kids to become fans. And so it's this unfortunate reality that we're trying to change. But while the NFL has accepted this, the other sports are still fighting back. So the National Hockey League and FIFA and World Rugby all still deny. Some of them are making changes, but they will not talk about CTE. And I think that's unfortunate.
I was going to ask you, we've talked largely about wrestling, we've talked about the NFL football, American football, and boxing, of course, the obvious one. How much wider is it when it comes to sports?
It's anywhere where you're getting hit in the head hundreds of times a year with force is a risk. So, we published out of like 376 NFL players, 93% had it. We just published that 18 of the first 19 NHL players that we studied had it. In a rugby study that we partnered with a brain bank in Scotland and a brain bank in Australia, we found that half of our population had it, and your odds went up 15% per year you played. Soccer is another one where it's harder to study in the US because there aren't a lot of old soccer players here, but the UK, they found that pro soccer players in Scotland have 4 times the risk of dementia, and when you look at their brains, it's almost exclusively CTE. So we know it's out there, but forcing people to accept that or make these changes is a different battle. We're sort of reliving big tobacco in many ways that they don't want to acknowledge it because there's a business here to run.
The other arm of your work is Boston University's CTE Center. How does that streamline in with your work with the foundation?
So when we partnered with Boston University in 2007, basically the idea was, look, you guys are the amazing scientists, but like calling families when people die is not a skill set they had. No one ever had that. So we were sort of the front door of doing the outreach and reaching out to players, letting them know about this, and then translating those findings into messaging and policy. And so I've been very lucky to be a member of that research team, but I'm not the one in the lab studying the brains. I never trained for that. But it's a wonderful partnership because they're really truly independent, brilliant scientists who just really care about this and have just created the field no matter how much resistance has come their way and how many times they're questioned by colleagues. And
we created the Center for the Study of Traumatic Encephalopathy. And now Dr. Stern heads the clinical research. Dr. McKee heads the pathological research in basic sciences. Dr. Cantu is our concussion expert. And then my role is to facilitate the research.
I'm sorry, who's this?
This is Chris Nowinski from Boston University School of Medicine.
And when an athlete passes away,
I read about his passing today, and I'm really sorry to be calling. I know I'm the last person in the world you want to hear from.
it's my job to call the family to see if the brain's available.
It's been sort of funny watching doctors funded by sports leagues try to push back, constantly be proved wrong, and just come up with a different argument, move the goalpost back. And we were very proud that in 2023, the National Institutes of Health finally changed their language to recognize that repetitive brain trauma causes CTE.
So it's kind of baby steps to some degree. But having said that, you're a tall guy. The bigger steps than most people could make, I guess.
Yeah.
I think what wakes people up is, are the stories. The human side of it all. And, we mentioned Andre Waters and taking his own life. Tell me about some of these, because some of these are people who were highly respected, very successful, and then their lives end up in a very strange place.
Yeah, I mean, the stories are sort of endless. I mean, at the beginning, started with Waters, then Justin Strelzik, who's 36-year-old NFL lineman, started hearing voices and decided to, bizarre behaviors, got in a chase with the police and decided to go on the wrong side of the highway and run into a tanker truck and die. And he had it. And the third brain I coordinated was Chris Benoit, who was a colleague of mine with the WWE for 5 years. And I knew was the nicest guy, who had taught me how to throw a decent forearm on his own head, would just offer me like, show me how you throw a forearm and I'll work on it with you. And I just whack him. And he didn't get mad about it. He was just like, I'm going to help you. And then suddenly he doesn't show up to a wrestling show. And they go to his house and found he's killed his 7-year-old son, his wife, and himself. And he had confided in me a few months prior that he had been concerned about how many concussions he had. He was sort of the only person interested in the book I was writing at the time. So then there's that. And now we have multiple murders in the group. Philip Adams, a former NFL player in his late 30s, started developing sort of paranoid schizophrenic tendencies. They found notebooks he'd written that made no sense. And he just went down the street and killed 6 people, including 2 children. I mean, we told a story this weekend about Corwin Brown, captain at Michigan, which means highly respected, 8 years in the NFL, NFL and college coach, D coordinator at Notre Dame. At 40, he develops paranoid schizophrenia and bipolar and goes home, takes his wife hostage while his kids are 9, 11, and 13. And he's been living with them ever since, all knowing what's going on. And those kids are never been the same. So it's just, you hear about these really horrible things. Aaron Hernandez, the former NFL player, decided to kill 2 people when he just signed a $40 million contract. And they get attention. And we can't always tie the brain disease to this, although we should be absolutely paying attention to it. And we probably are causing some people to develop schizophrenia. We already know traumatic brain injuries cause, mental health symptoms, schizophrenia, bipolar. And then, but the more common issue is people who develop cognitive problems in their 50s, 60s, 70s. This progressive Alzheimer's-like neurodegeneration that comes with bizarre behaviors. And so, there's just a lot of those stories, and a lot of the families never tell the truth about what happened, but it changes you in a big way.
I mean, you're saying 70 onwards, all right, you could imagine it wouldn't be as obvious. But when you're talking about Andre Waters, 44, I think, when it happened, when he took his life, people who are 40, and what sort of age bracket does it tend to hit at when it's severe sports?
Well, that's the big question. So when we just published a study looking at 160 brains of athletes who had been donated to the brain bank, just under half had CTE. In that group, 70% had apathy, depression, cognitive problems, all this stuff. But also the people who didn't have it had that, because people are basically donating the brain when they see those things. So it's hard to tell what is the brain injury and what isn't. You can have those things in other ways, and that's been used to discredit this or try to cast doubt upon it. But the reality is CTE is sometimes used to describe sort of a larger clinical problem, which is if you get hit in the head thousands of times, we've identified at least 13 different ways that your brain is injured and degenerating that we can measure. CT is just one of them. And CT starts, again, very small and progresses, but you can have a ton of white matter lesions and damage even when you have very microscopic CT. So in the younger cases who have these bizarre behaviors, it may not just be driven by the CT. It really could be the white matter damage, the vascular damage, all these different types of injuries that are happening in the brain. So it's sort of the idea that we're confident that cognitive change later in life, midlife and later, that's progressive and doesn't respond to treatment, that is usually predictive of CTE. The midlife behavioral stuff, sometimes CT is there, sometimes it's not. And that's why we try to tell people who are having those problems, leave CT out, just get treatment.
So you're dealing with actually what is a web of conditions depending on how much damage has been done to the brain and what sort of damage.
Yeah.
It's quite a complex web actually in that way, which makes your job harder in a way. But at least with CTE, you can identify it, especially now that you have the brain bank.
Correct.
In order to be able to go through it. What would make your life easier in getting this message out?
I think if the reality is, the best way to get this message out would be in partnership with sports organizations, right? They have the ear of everybody, and they've shown that they've been able to change public health on a lot of different sides, like heat illness and various things. So the idea that they're fighting us on this and that CT is not something you're allowed to talk about in sports is a tremendous missed opportunity, because the way I look at it, like as a former pro wrestler, I used to let people hit me in the head with folding chairs. Like, if you're an adult, you can do a dangerous job if you want to. It's not, being a pro wrestler is no more dangerous than being a cop or a firefighter or serving in the military. Like, it's a job. But you should have informed consent, and you should take reasonable steps to protect yourself. You don't have to destroy yourself if there's another way to get there. And that's sort of where wrestling has gone with this, is that they've invited me back in, and now I lecture the WWE, the AEW, all the wrestling groups once a year, and I show them what we're learning, how bad it can be, and let them make the choice of when are they going to take the risks and when are they going to do things differently. And they're making much better decisions. Concussion rates are way down. It's very exciting. But on the flip side, sports is not the same way. And so we still are recruiting kids young, hitting them in the head hundreds of times, and we're absolutely creating this, and we're not talking about it. And that's not the way that we should be doing this. This is our own kids. We're supposed to be building a community here, and now we're not taking care of each other.
Well, there's no future, of course, if you're going to have this kind of situation. So what you were saying earlier about the fact there are some changes in how young people can, for example, head a ball in soccer and so on, it's nowhere near enough, it sounds like.
Well, sorry. So where I was going to go with that is that what we should be able to agree on is that kids should not get CTE, right? If adults want to get CTE, I get it. Like, if you don't think there's another way to make money, fine. I hope there are, but there may not be. But there's no way that a kid can understand this brain disease and provide informed consent. So, like, when the Football Association in England recently banned heading to 12, that's great. Some would argue it should be banned till 18 because kids don't understand. I think we can probably minimize the exposure enough that nobody will get it by 18. We've sort of identified with soccer that punts, goal kicks, and corners are the biggest 3 contributors because of the highest impacts. And so if you just said, okay, you can't head a ball when the goalie punts it, you have to play it off your chest. And like, small changes like that could actually almost prevent CTE from, we should probably call it pediatric CTE. We need to prevent pediatric CTE. Right. If adults want to get it, I get it. But we could also prevent most cases of that too with just some simple changes. But we just have to understand how bad it is. We have to hear these stories. We have to review the data and realize this is not something you should sentence another person to.
As someone who's played football and someone who's wrestled, knowing how those sports actually work, could you see them developing in a way that can minimize the exposure to CTE, but still keep the thrill, if you like?
Absolutely. I mean, the simple answer for football, if you actually add up people's hits over a career and look back who gets CTE, CTE is a math problem, right? Number of hits and strength of those hits will predict who gets it. If we played non-tackle until high school, flag football until high school, and then in high school, we took out hitting in practice, and we all played like Coach Buddy Tevens used to have Dartmouth play, which you never tackle each other. They actually had robotic dummies you would tackle. And you eliminated 70% of head impacts over a season through that, plus trained them how to tackle better. You would basically get people down to like 10 or 20% of the exposure by the age of 18. And you'd have very, very rare cases of CT in young people. And then in college and pros, you could still make it less, but it would be there. But you could probably cut 80% of CT out just through changing practice and raising the age when you start. So it is doable, but no one wants to do it because it risks the business model. Because if you don't get kids playing young, they don't become fans when they're old. And that's sort of a problem that we have to deal with. On wrestling, CT doesn't have to exist at all. Pro wrestling is fake, right? It's theater.
You said it.
Yeah. It's theater. And so the idea is that, like, if we don't hit each other in the head for real, you will not get this disease. And the brain can take a concussion or 2 or 3 without creating CT. We don't see it in regular people who had couple brain injuries. So it's just getting rid of that repetitive trauma, which for the most part we have. And I'm eager to see that we don't get this in the next generation.
Is there a big difference in the outcomes when you compare professional sport and amateur sport?
Well, I push back immediately on the idea of professional sport versus amateur sport. We have scientists in this space who like to make that distinction. That distinction is completely scientifically meaningless. Whether you got paid to do it means nothing about. We should be looking at it as just an exposure curve, right? And the way with football, we've been able to show that your odds of CT go up between 15 and 30% per year you play. In ice hockey, it was 34%. In rugby, it was 40%. That's like years of play is sort of our pack years of smoking. And that's the only way we should be thinking about it. And then we can drill down even further by number and strength of head impacts using sensors. But right now, just years of play. So it is a massive problem in some professional sports, and it is slightly less of a problem for each level of amateur going down.
I was thinking it more from the perspective of the kind of money that's involved. That's why. Because it's probably easier to change an environment when there isn't so much at stake, at the wallet.
Yeah, you would think so, but what we're fighting against is the idea of tradition. Like when we first started saying why your kids shouldn't be heading a ball, the pushback was, but that's part of the game. And it's like, well, the guy who started saying heading a ball did not know what CTE was. Right. And he probably would have said, maybe we shouldn't do this if it's going to cause your brain to rot later on in your life. So tradition is a terrible reason to be destroying the brains of children. And you would think amateur would be easier to change, but it has been proven to be harder because it's also very regional. And the problem with football versus ice hockey is that ice hockey in the US and in Canada is sort of governed by one organization, USA Hockey Canada. With football in the United States, there's no governing body. No one sets the rules. And so I once sat there at a panel with the head of Pop Warner who said, look, even if I want to get rid of youth tackle, it would just let one of my competitors come into that town, start a youth tackle league, and all the families who wanted to play would go there, and I'd put myself out of business. So the fact that there's no regulation of youth tackle football is why 5-year-olds are still getting hit in the head hundreds of times.
Presumably, if you can get through to the athletes themselves and they get a real sense of how dangerous it is and the consequences, then irrespective of what the league says, they could start to change things.
The athletes themselves, well, I guess at the youth level, what are we going to tell a 5-year-old, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's,
I was thinking of the older ones.
Well, but that's really the issue. The sad thing is, because again, the professionals are 1% of the population, right? I get a call every year from some 23-year-old NFL player who just realized, hey, the CT thing's real, right? I might already have it, right? And they're shocked. But now they're well, I'm getting paid $1 million a year. I can't walk away now. But that light bulb does not really go on for most people until their 20s, no matter what we tell them, no matter what they've read in the paper, no matter what documentary they've seen. It's really hard to understand this. So now that we have told, there was a big moment, 2010, the National Football League Players Association put together a committee, part of my urging, of their own experts to sort of combat the NFL's narrative on this. And at the first meeting, they said, what should we do? Give us one idea. And the idea I said is stop hitting in practice. And the doctors didn't necessarily jump on it, but the players did. Because the players are all sitting in the back going, well, A, we hate hitting in practice anyway. We're not getting paid for that. And B, they said, oh, that it'll prevent CT? Yeah, we're all in. And they put in the collective bargaining agreement that they could only hit 14 days all season. Right, so the players at the NFL level are fighting for themselves. The National Hockey League just started their CT committee, so they're having their first meeting this summer, and so hopefully they'll start pushing back too.
So there is an expansion in the conversation. At least.
There is, right? More people are coming to the table.
There's a term I want to get your take on it, which I've heard a couple of times: subconcussive. Where does that fit into all of this? Is that even a thing?
I'm trying to eliminate that term. So we wrote an editorial in the British Journal of Sports Medicine saying subconcussive has been a misleading and dangerous term. What started as the idea was there are hits that you take that are not concussive, usually lower than a concussion, but they seem to correlate with CT better than the concussions themselves. But the problem with sub is it makes you think those hits are small. And the reality is 10% of the hits that a football player will take in a season are harder than the average concussion. But what predicts when you feel your brain getting damaged is a little bit random. The harder the hit, the more likely you are to feel something. But even then, you're not feeling your actual brain getting damaged.
I was just saying, exactly, because you don't have the pain sensitivity.
Right, you notice functional differences in your brain, right? But the idea is, you have 100 billion neurons in your brain. Would you actually feel one die? Would you be able to notice if 1 million went offline? No. And so we basically wrote the editorial saying we need to change the terms. When we talk about impacts, where we don't actually know what's happening in the brain, it's either, and we're doing studies, we're labeling them a concussive impact or a non-concussive impact, understanding that Some of those hits are harder than concussions. And then when we talk about the injury itself, you either have a traumatic brain injury or you can have a subclinical traumatic brain injury, which means that you don't feel anything, but we know microscopically your brain's getting damaged. And that sort of started to help people understand why concussions don't predict CTE, which is an important thing for people to know, right? It doesn't matter if you had 2 or 5 or 10, none of that predicts who gets CT, but the number and strength of the head hits you take does. And there was one stat we included in there where there's a study that showed college football players, for every 1 concussion they take, will take 341 hits harder than that concussion. And that's probably where the CT risk really lies. Hard hits that you think you're fine on.
So you even have the difficulty in kind of setting the parameters that people can measure.
Yeah, and developing
quite
a
difficult
language
puzzle you have to kind of put together.
Yes, it's a moving target because we're learning as we go.
What has helped you along the way? What has been the biggest tool you've had that has allowed you to get your message across?
I mean, probably the biggest tool we've had is the scientists give us a diagnosis, and then the families have been so generous in sharing their stories with the world. Without this constant drumbeat of stories and data, we would not have this conversation. And that's something I did realize very early on, is that especially at the beginning days, this was a disease that was primarily happening to celebrities, right? Famous athletes. If you want to get people to hear about it, you had to sort of work with the media to tell their stories. And the media has been a great partner on this. While the NFL is trying to silence everyone, they've gone out on a limb and said, no, this is a public health reality that we need to talk about. So it's that combination of the great science, amazing families, and being able to share their stories through the media that has gotten the world aware of this.
It sounds more like the human stories have had more impact than the developments in technology, but I'm guessing it's a balance between the two.
Yes, I mean, without the advances in science, no one could take those stories seriously. The stories are backed by ever-increasing solid science showing that this is, no matter what the critics say, this is a real disease that is caused by head impacts and it is causing people to get dementia.
I'm presuming, Dr. Nowinski, you also have to hit every layer in this chain, if you like, or in this stack. You've got the players themselves, you've got managers, you've got the team, kind of the team branding, you've got scientists, you also have the coaches. Where do the coaches fit into this in terms of what's their sense of responsibility to the players?
That's a great question. So, yeah, most coaches don't want to engage in this. There's been one coach, a guy named Buddy Tevens at Dartmouth University, who was a former player, who was the first coach to get rid of tackling in his practices because he believed in this. And we diagnosed multiple players that he had coached over his career with CTE. And he was the only person to ever ask me, if you diagnose one of my guys with CTE, I want to hear about it. And I said, would you talk to their family? It would mean a lot to them. And he started calling their families to find out what happened to them and to learn and to try to incorporate that into what he knew. But he's the only one. The reality is, and what no one wants to talk about is, a coach in football can determine if his players get CT or not by how he practices. He influences that in a big way. Nobody wants that responsibility, especially because they didn't know they were doing this, 10 years ago, right? So that there's got to be some cognitive dissonance there, right? Like, who wants the guilt of thinking that how I designed practice might have contributed to this person's demise? And so it is not a blame game on coaches, but I think we have to, we have to understand this. We have to address this. I am excited that things are changing because more and more coaches have lost friends of theirs to this. And so I have a call tomorrow morning with a college football coach to talk about developing a CT prevention protocol to be put next to his concussion protocol on paper of all the ways that he's trying to prevent CT by minimizing hitting in practice and how they train. If there are more coaches like this coach, we have a chance to actually make a change.
It sounds logical to have that CT protocol.
I agree. No, I mean, it's completely logical, but you have to first accept that CT is caused by hits to the head and that it's worth preventing. And right now, very few people are willing to admit both those things.
Is your work essentially limited to the United States, or are you able to take this and scale it out internationally?
We have been able to take this internationally to English-speaking countries. So I recognized early on that we all read each other's news. And so this conversation started in the UK, and this conversation is happening a little bit in Australia and South Africa. And so we decided to really push the international starting in 2018, and in part because the NFL, when they were fighting this, started importing international doctors to come say, we don't have this in our country, therefore this must be all mass hysteria and not real. And one of them, the lead of that, was an Australian researcher. And so I said, one good turn deserves another, and I went to Australia and started a brain bank. And that brain bank, the Australian Sports Brain Bank, has now diagnosed had 150 brain donations, and half of them have had CTE. And it led to national Senate hearings and a complete change, including the Australian Football League acknowledging cause and effect. So that has been tremendous. The UK has done a great job changing on this. There's a neuropathologist here, Willie Stewart, who's really led the movement there, and now we collaborate, and that's happening. Canada, this is happening. But outside of those countries, and New Zealand, it's almost nowhere.
So the interesting thing about the international kind of collaboration is that if you have a sport that's played in different countries and each adopts a different protocol, the game changes and perhaps teams are not competing in the same way or as on equal terms.
Right.
That must be a big challenge.
You're absolutely right. Like, the big question around heading in soccer is, are you going to be at a competitive disadvantage if your team is practicing less or doing less? So it is, it's been sort of easier in a way to fight American football in America. But when you get to soccer and rugby as global sports, it is a much more complicated reform.
And it's so emotive as well. I mean, just people get so emotional about it, as you probably discovered.
Yes,
yeah. Are there any sports you would advocate actually banning?
I mean, certainly, like, I don't feel it's fair to ever expose young children to hundreds of head impacts a year knowing it can create CT. So, like, we've tried to ban youth tackle football before the age of 12 in America. And we actually were able to convince an entire the California legislators to do it, and the governor threatened to veto it. So, you shouldn't. I mean, you definitely shouldn't have, like, boxing and some of these things for children. Like, it should not exist. But the reason why it does is often cultural. It has less to do with what's best for the kid and more what are the kid's options, and is CT a better option than joining a gang? And I think it's a false equivalence, but that's where the conversation immediately goes.
It's interesting. I've interviewed a number of boxers, including recently Tyson Fury and Alexander Usyk, world champions. And of course, it's become such a big, wealthy, powerful sport. So that kind of, people literally want to see blood. It's kind of sad that people want to see it at its most brutal. How do you fight the psychology of the public?
That's a good question. So the approach is, the public can have their blood sports if they want them, right? Really, if you're talking about pros, you have to talk to the athletes. Do you want this for yourself? And if you do, make sure you get paid for it, right? And make sure you understand the choice you're making and how it might affect your family. But I don't need to tell, you can't change the public's interest in contact or collision sports. Although having them appreciate the damage it's doing to them does help get them behind reforms, right? So, like, the NFL, what's most interesting now is, like, the pro wrestling audience is amazingly educated. So if they think someone actually has a concussion in the ring, they want you to stop the match, lift the veil, break the fourth wall, and take care of that person. So that's been interesting to see. You can educate the fans. But the other side of it is, like, we just have to keep talking about, okay, you can have that, but what about the kids? Why are we doing this to kids? Like, that's the biggest and easiest change we need to make, is the sports we have for entertainment should not be the sports we have kids playing.
Could you feasibly have a window for athletes and say, before a certain age and after a certain age, it's stopped? Is that even a fair, kind of concept?
Yeah, I honestly, every sport should have a version that doesn't cause CT before 14. Like, that's a easy black and white issue. We should not have kids colliding with each other hundreds of times before the age of 14. We don't have that, but we should have that.
What would you like to see happen next, Dr. Nowinski?
So I know it's going to be an iterative change to make sports safer, iterative change to make adults safer and educate them. But I do think we have to start pushing CT education widely so that the change happens faster. But what I'm thinking about today is, I'm thinking about the next 10 years. We need to start clinical trials to start to figure out how to cure this thing. Like, I'm starting to think about my own age now. I'm getting into my late 40s. Like, if we don't start clinical trials now, there's no chance we'll have a drug in 10 years when I might really need it. And so we have to nail down how to diagnose it in living people enough so that people are willing to invest in actual treatments.
Where do you think you are in this equation at the moment? What do you expect to happen to you in the next few years?
I hope nothing interesting in the next few years, but I would not be surprised if I follow the path of many, which is your late 60s and 70s can get pretty scary. Like, and it's a conversation I had with my wife when we got married. It's like, I don't know what's going on up there. I'm hoping to fix it before I really need it. But the reality is, the stories we hear from our families are usually never great. But it doesn't have to be the end of the world. So I'll just continue to fight while I can.
So then, Dr. Nowinski, what gives you hope? What are the stories that make you feel, what are the things that you see in the work you do that make you feel there is something good that can come out of this?
So you hear about the tragic stories, but for every tragic story, there's one where somebody who was at risk didn't end it tragically. So last week I went to the funeral of Don Hasselbeck. So famous NFL player, his two sons played in the NFL. He died of a heart attack tragically at 70. 15 years ago, he had pledged to donate his brain. He'd done a media tour with us. He'd spoken about how he had way more concussions than he was comfortable with. And he didn't quite feel right. But I stayed in touch with him, and he never showed any serious symptoms. And it was the most impressive funeral I'd ever seen, in the sense that everybody could just talk about what a great father he was, what a great husband he was, what a great grandfather he was. And it never affected him, whatever was going on in there. And I think if I could get to 70 and have people talk about me that way, remember me that way, I will be very happy.
Well, I wish that future for you too. Dr. Chris Nowinski, thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Chris Nowinski there. And his organization is ready to fully support people who feel they might be at risk with CTE. Just contact the Concussion Legacy Foundation. And I recommend that you take a look at the full documentary Head Games online to get awareness of CTE risks and to hear Chris Nowinski's full journey on the path to raise awareness of this serious issue. But that's it for now from me and the team. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to leave a comment and to subscribe. We'll see you next time.